A library is a curated collection of sources of information, selected by experts and made accessible to a defined community for reference or borrowing. Curating sources of information is an ancient practice that dates as far back as 1200 BC. The oldest known libraries were found in an ancient port city in northern Syria called Ugarit. Throughout most of recorded history, the defined community of libraries were nobility, aristocrats, scholars, and theologians. Libraries were never intended for commoners or laymen. Very small factions of people essentially had a monopoly on information, making it very difficult for common people to become informed citizens or even do anything besides whatever their family did to survive. There have been attempts to break up this concentration of information with commune-supported institutions like the Malatistina Library, but widely accessible library systems did not begin until the 1800s. The Peterborough Town Library in Peterborough, New Hampshire, was the first public library in the world supported by tax dollars. 21 years later, the Boston Public Library opened its doors to the public, becoming the first large public library funded by tax dollars in the US. The idea behind the public library system was to function as a supplement in creating an educated and literate population by providing a level of access to resources that would be unattainable for most people. Buying a book may not be much of an issue, but buying multiple books can be very expensive. People solved this issue by collectively pitching in a very small amount of money to finance something that everyone collectively owns and has access to. This seems like the sort of thing that any reasonable person would get behind, especially if they are middle class or lower, but this doesn't really seem to be the case today. If the concept of the public library never existed, and if someone were to propose such an idea today, many people would think it's some radical pie-in-the-sky nonsense. But why is that? Doesn't it just make sense to push for public goods and things people have collective ownership of, especially if the public good provides basic necessities? If I were to take a guess about why this mentality exists, I'd say it's grounded in an undying faith in capitalism and competition. Some people genuinely believe that the free market will always adjust accordingly and competition is always a good thing. The truth of the matter is that some markets have demands that are so stable that competition cannot increase the demand. An example of this would be something like the demand for primary and secondary education. Competition here will not increase demand. People having more kids will. There are also demands that raise serious moral questions when capitalized on, like the need for prisons. This is something that should not be capitalized on because profit motive creates an incentive to try to find ways to increase the demand to increase profit. In America, the private prison lobby has pushed for a broader concept of criminality and harsher punishments, even if the offenses are nonviolent and victimless. It also doesn't make sense from a business perspective to try to reform inmates. You'd ideally want them to come right back so more profit can be generated from them. This is why America has the highest prison population in the world and the highest recidivism rate. Also, private prisons don't really perform any better than state prisons. Many would even argue they perform worse.
Private prisons serve an important role during a difficult period, but time has shown that they compare poorly to our own bureau facilities. They simply do not provide the same level of correctional services, programs, and resources. They do not save substantially on costs, and they do not maintain the same level of safety and security.
So yeah, capitalism and competition is not always the best way to meet the demands for things like prisons and schools. From my personal experience, whenever I have this type of conversation with free market types, they don't really seem to budge. We never move on to talking about things that should be capitalized on and what things should be public. Questioning the almighty free market makes this crowd feel like capitalism in general is being attacked. They may even feel like they are personally being attacked for having so much faith in it. This is pretty understandable because there are actually a lot of people who are completely anti-capitalist and are very vocal about it. The secondary cause for this resistance of public goods and social ownership is pretty simple. That shit is socialism. So, what exactly is socialism? It must be bad if so many people are against it, right? Well, socialism is a social and economic doctrine that calls for social ownership rather than private ownership of property and natural resources. Social ownership can be in the form of public, collective, or cooperative ownership, or it can be citizen ownership of equity. Public ownership is the ownership of an industry, asset, or enterprise by the state or public body representing a community instead of a private party. The U.S. Postal Service and public transportation systems are examples of this type of ownership. Collective or cooperative ownership is the ownership of the means of production by all members of a group for the benefit of all its members. These institutions can be owned and managed by people who use their services, managed by workers, or hybrid cooperatives that share ownership between different stakeholder groups. California Dairies and Land O'Lakes are a couple of the many cooperative organizations in America. Citizen ownership of equity is achieved either by having public or employee-owned pension funds that own corporate stock. So now, none of this sounds particularly scary, harmful, or even unfamiliar for that matter. We are talking about stuff like public schools, social security, and fire departments. House fires are no good, and I think that we can all agree that post offices are useful. But many people are still adamantly against socialism, or at least they think they're against it. If I were to choose something to shake my fist at about all this, I would pick the Overton Window. Oh, bitch-ass window. The Overton Window is a concept that describes acceptable discourse within a nation at certain points in time. The concept describes a spectrum from more free to less free with regard to government intervention oriented vertically on an axis. This last point is important because I've heard people say that this window has shifted to the right. I understand the sentiment, but the Overton Window has nothing to do with left-right political spectrum. This concept is only about public perception of government intervention. The window starts in the middle with things that are already policy. Then it expands to popular positions that aren't policy yet. Sensible and acceptable ideas are next. Then we get to positions that are unthinkable to the public. In today's political climate, America has definitely shifted upward towards more freedom on the window. People are still concerned with addressing the problems caused by industrialization and capitalism as they always were, but people of today are so far removed from the problems of the late 19th and early 20th centuries that we seem to have forgotten why many of the regulations we have are so important. This could possibly explain why Republican politicians are able to frame deregulation in general as a good thing without their supporters questioning which regulations they are referring to.
To rip up some regulations.
Other contributing factors to the shifting Overton window are association and conflation. When a person does not have much knowledge of a concept, they have to rely on what they associate with the concept in order to make value judgments about it. If a person comes to associate a concept with something they understand as being bad, they will conflate the concept with the bad thing. An example of this would be Nazis. Some people have understandably associated socialism with Nazis because they were also known as the National Socialist Party. Nazis are bad, so socialism must be bad too, right? The fact of the matter is that Hitler's National Socialist Party was only socialist in name. Hitler's campaign platform was centered around socialism because Social Democrats were dominant at the time. Hitler just pandered to voters to get elected. After Hitler gained power, he actually ordered for a purge of Social Democrats and moderate conservatives that undermined his power. At least 85 people died as a result of this purge, and more than 1,000 people were arrested. The Nazis presented this purge to the public as a preventive measure against an alleged coup. This purge was known as the Night of the Long Knives. So, saying that Hitler's National Socialist Party was socialist is about as accurate as saying that buffalo wings are made from buffalo meat because, the name. Another example of association and conflation would be Venezuela. People who bring up Venezuela as a reason why socialism is bad do this because they are aware that something bad happened in Venezuela, but they don't really seem to be aware of what in particular went wrong, nor do they know why things went wrong. They just know that Venezuela is not considered to be a prosperous nation, so they associate poverty and people eating rats or whatever with the nation. The logic is pretty much, Venezuela is not doing well. Venezuela has socialism. Socialism must be bad. It may be true that Venezuela has some socialistic institutions, but the problem of Venezuela is more of a result of gross mismanagement, corruption, and external attempts to undermine the nation. I recently reached out to the Socialist Party of Great Britain, or SPGB, on Twitter, and they explained to me that they don't even consider Venezuela a real example of anything socialistic. They pointed out that Venezuela was more of an example of aggressively shifting control of the means of production to the state instead of shifting the control to the people. The person from SPGB referred to the system seen in Venezuela as statism and reformism, and not really socialism. Probably the biggest factor that is causing the shift in the Overton window is the fact that America was in a Cold War not that long ago with a communist nation. Some people are aware of the fact that communism and socialism are both derived from Marxist critiques of capitalism, so they conflate the two concepts. The thinking is pretty much this. Communism is associated with bad countries who wanted to bomb America, so communism must be inherently bad. Communism is kind of like socialism, I think, so that must be bad too. All of the misconceptions people have are actually pretty understandable, and I don't blame people for having them. My real problem is with the people who knowingly fan the flames. In America, it is perfectly legal for corporations to throw money at politicians to influence legislation in ways they will benefit from, even if these corporate interests are not in the best interest of the public.
There's no limit.
So there's none. So I can be totally funded by oil and gas. I can be totally funded by Big Pharma, come in, write Big Pharma laws, and there's no limits to that whatsoever.
That's right.
Corporations want to be able to do whatever they want without any regulations because it fattens their profit margins. They could give two shits about the consequences, especially if they aren't being held liable and aren't obviously affected by anything within their lifetime. So fuck it. Dump bullshit into bodies of water because it's cheaper than being responsible. This is the main reason why Cold War paranoia about socialism still exists even in younger generations. Politicians and Dennis Prager types knowingly conflate common sense regulations with socialism and socialism with Nazis and shit. In terms of what to do about all this, I don't know. What do you guys think is a good strategy to lessening the fear about socialism? I would love to see your suggestions in the comments. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe if you like the content.